but implications to some of these questions that were just asked. It reminds me that I want to do it now. What I am sharing with you are my own personal views. Nothing more than my personal views. If the House of Justice wants to say something, it says it in black and white. In English, it gets translated immediately into all the languages of the world, and we all hear about it at the same time. Because Baha'u'llah has created a level playing field. There are no, there's not some secret information in the cause that is only shared with those people who have the psychic strength to bear such weight. We all start off in the same place. And so all of us have our own views. Let's hope that if there's somebody who's as privileged as I feel to sit in the meetings of the House of Justice and those consultations, that I benefit. I hope I benefit. And I hope that I assume that what I say is influenced by what I hear. But they're personal views. They have nothing to do with the statements of the House of Justice or the views of the House of Justice. And you should be very, very clear about that. So let me deal first of all with this question which is focused on Israel and the Palestinians and so on, which is really only the media's way into much larger questions. If somebody asked, was there any reference to the Jews as a chosen people? Well, of course, the Jews are the chosen people throughout Scripture. There's no question that they are. We simply didn't know until now what that meant. And it is obvious that what Baha'u'llah has done, for his own reasons and in his own way, first of all, Abdu'l-Baha makes it clear that the suffering of the Jews has ended. That their iniquities, or whatever you want to call it, have been forgiven. That's over. That is history. That is finished. No one has any right to rebuke them, to raise the question at all. Abdu'l-Baha said that they will, in his own lifetime, he said that they will return, that the time had come for their, Baha'u'llah said, had come for their return to the Holy Land, that they would build there a society that would be the admiration of their friends and the envy of their foes. That is, of course, exactly what has happened. I don't really need to say any more about that except one other thing, and that is the strange dispensations of providence that Baha'u'llah has provided his world center with a shield that is impregnable. There is a heart and nerve center of this world faith of ours, and it is impregnable. We didn't create it. We had no capacity to create it. For his own purposes and in his own ways, through historical processes that nobody could have predicted, the state of Israel came into existence. It is enormously powerful in every way that you could think of, and it has, the result of this has been that unlike the Turkish period of history or the British mandate, suddenly you have a democratic government, you have courts, you have the rule of law, you have bailiffs. You can go to the courts with deeds of ownership of property that would have got you nowhere under the British mandate or under the Ottoman Empire. And if the courts find in your favor, the bailiffs execute the decisions of the courts. Just like Iceland, just like Canada, just like Germany, just like the United Kingdom. This, of course, is an enormous bounty and protection for the cause, and which doesn't mean we don't have problems, because in every government, including Iceland, I'm sure, certainly in Canada, the United States, any other government I know of, you have one thing at the upper level where there are people that you can talk to who understand the world, and then you have all kinds of little functionaries with rubber stamps down at the lower level who love to have their rubber stamps. I mean, their life revolves around their rubber stamp, and to put their rubber stamp on the document is the ultimate expression power on their part. So naturally, at the civil service level in any government, you have difficulties. But thank God we are protected from the terrible threats. You can imagine a community like ours that depends so much on centralized guidance, at least on fundamental principles. If it were exposed, if any hostile force could come in and bulldoze the Shrine of the Bab, or put the House of Justice members on trial, or murder Baha'is, and that could happen very easily in the world we live in. It can't happen under the conditions that exist now. That's one thing. That's not a pronouncement. That's just the fact of history, which none of us can pretend to understand. God does what he wants to do when he wants to do it, when it's important enough to him to do it. If it isn't important enough to him to do it, as we all know, he doesn't do it, unfortunately, for some of our private plans. The other thing, of course, is that the same force, malevolent force of religious prejudice and hatred of others that has persecuted our community mindlessly, purposely, gratuitously, without any provocation for 150 years, that murdered the Bab, that murdered thousands of Baha'is, that persecuted Baha'u'llah every day of his life, that persecuted Abdu'l-Baha, that threatened to crucify the guardian on the in front of the shrine, that has murdered the 3 successive National Assemblies. This same deranged force, which you can only describe as hatred of, quote, the other, hatred of anyone who isn't like me. This same force has now, very unwisely on its part, begun to attack the Western world, and attack the Hindu world, and attack other parts of the world too, because it is the force of religious prejudice. That's what September the 11th was all about. Now one could say, this is because people are deprived, because people are desperate. You hear this in the European press, excuse me. You hear this in European... If economic deprivation were the cause of September the 11th, then the people who would have been at the controls of the planes that crashed into the World Trade Center would most certainly have been Africans, because they are the most deprived, the most unjustly treated people on the face of the globe, and there's nobody even close to them. If deprivation and injustice were the cause of this violence, then it would be people from Bolivia and Ecuador and so on who would be strapping dynamite to themselves and blowing themselves up in shopping malls and buses and so on, because they are far more deprived than the people who are actually doing it. The fact is, these acts of these atrocities are being committed out of religious hatred. The people who are committing these acts hate the rest of mankind. I don't know how to put it any more clearly. They don't just hate people, say, in a country like Israel. They don't just hate people in a country like the United States. They hate everybody who will not submit to their particular... Now, I don't mean that this religious prejudice is only affecting one particular community on earth. Unfortunately, one particular community does appear to be particularly captive of this madness, and that is the very community that has persecuted Baha'is for 150 years. You cannot do that to the messenger of God. You cannot do that to those who have sacrificed themselves for his cause and not suffer horribly. Because if you begin attacking God and you begin attacking the servants of God and the friends of God and the trustees of God, you will finally attack the whole of humankind. And the whole of humankind will squash you. I don't know whether that answers the question, but I think we have to be realistic. And I think for Baha'is, we are challenged to avoid involvement in partisan politics. One of the most distressing things is to see the way in which the media and governments, unfortunately, in certain parts of the world, feel perfectly qualified to make pronouncements on these things and to twist facts this way or that way, or to suit some preconceived. That's their business. They will answer to God in due course in their own way. We don't want to get involved. As Baha'is, we can't get involved. There are certain things we know. We do know the way that we are under protection. We do know that we have been and are continuing to be persecuted. We do know that religious hatred and religious fanaticism is the real moving force, the most destructive moving force in the world today. And it is very obvious from reading the writings of the Guardian in particular what the end of that will be. He spoke very, very severely. He said, consider what the Jews suffered for 3 years for the persecution of Jesus Christ. Think what those who murdered the Bab, who have persecuted the faith of Baha'u'llah for all these years, think what they are attracting to themselves. We don't need to know. These are not political issues. These are spiritual issues. But if we are clear on the spiritual issues, I think it helps us keep away from the manipulation of our minds, because our minds are being manipulated constantly by politicians and by the media. Something else I suppose one has to bear in mind is that, for reasons again that are mysterious to us, Baha'u'llah chose to give the government of the United States and of the Western Hemisphere the task of two things: binding the broken with the hands of justice and crushing the oppressor who flourisheth with the rod of the commandments of God. That's in his own words. And that obviously is a spiritual mandate. This is not a political one. This doesn't guarantee moral immaculacy to the hammer. The hammer, God deals with that. When he's finished using the hammer, he does whatever occurs to him next to do with the hammer. But we should avoid, I think, as Baha'is, because it's our spiritual welfare that's at stake, we should avoid taking seriously the superficial and very, very self-interested attempts to manipulate our minds by political and journalistic figures who are concerned only for their own careers and so on. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you very much. And you, in your talk, you referred to the core of the 5-year plan and the study circles, the Rui method. And there are a couple of questions that relate to that kind of cluster. There was an interest in hearing of how we can involve non-Baha'is to participate in the study circles. There was a question that relates to, in terms of these, should we devote our energies exclusively to the systematic growth process only, or should we also concentrate on traditional teaching methods of campaigns, proclamations, and the way we've done that before? And the related question, how can we reach the people of Iceland in the most effective way and bring them into the cause? And then the final one in that cluster relates to pioneering and the role of pioneering in the 5-year plan and in the way we conceive growth, and how we can learn from, there's a systematic growth, but we also are told that we can do mistakes, and how can we learn from our mistakes and use them in a constructive way to move forward.
Wow. Well, I'm glad you asked me those questions. It will relieve your minds immensely when I give you the answers. First of all, I think, with a few exceptions in the room, we're all Westerners. Whether we're Americans or Europeans or mid-Atlantic people who have the blessings of being mid-Atlantic people and being neither American or European like you do here in Iceland, we're still all Westerners. And we love magic bullets. We love to have a simple formula given to us. Use this formula, and in 30 days you will be a new man, or whatever the case may be. That's the way we are. Well, that's not the way that we have been trained by Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha and the Guardian, and now that we're very slowly, the penny is slowly dropping down, we're beginning to learn that it's different. So when we talk about the systematic promotion of the faith, we're not talking about a method that is unique, that excludes everything else. It is a way of systematizing everything that we do. Instead of doing it helter-skelter, happenstance, try it a little bit, oh my gosh, that's disappointing, let's try something else. That's our history. And that's necessary. That's a very adolescent way. We have been adolescents for the last 30 years or so. Now we're growing up. Now we're learning to be adults. It's like looking at movies about falling in love and getting married, and the whole thing is simply Disneyland. Any poor couple who takes seriously for a moment that that's how a man and a woman are going to spend their life together, they're headed for the divorce court before they're out of the chapel practically, because it just has no relationship to real life. It's all make-believe. That's what systematization of our work. We're growing up. A marriage requires working at it. Everybody in the room who's married knows exactly what I'm talking about. You systematically, day by day, you have to learn. You have to constantly make adjustments. For a person who happens to be the opposite, well, they're supposed to be the opposite sex from you. Anyway, that's certainly the Bahá'í idea to begin with. And they have enormous other differences from you, of culture and training and so on. And you know what marriage is like. You know that you work at it. You work at it for years and years, and it's the greatest thing in the world. There is absolutely nothing like it when it works. That's what we are in the middle of doing now. This is not a magic bullet. The Ruhi Institute has been something that has gotten us started. It's like the story I told you about the Canadians. We have been the Guardian said the faith is scientific in its method. We have been experimenting for the last several decades. Well, the purpose of experimentation is not a form of recreation. Experimentation is you're supposed to discover something. That's the idea of experimenting. And then when you discover it, you then begin to use it. And as soon as you begin to use it, you discover that it needs to be constantly adjusted and adapted, endlessly. And so what we call the Institute method has to use everything. It has to use all of what we've learned as individuals about dealing with our neighbors and so on. It has to incorporate all of those other elements, but it can do so systematically and deliberately. I think we have to, for one thing, and there's so much you could spend the rest of the weekend talking about this, and we haven't got the rest of the weekend because you've got a convention to do. So let me just mention a couple of things that seem very important. We have to stop making this strict distinction between the saved and the unwashed, the Baha'is and the, quote, non-Baha'is. there is it's like the temples. They're open for everybody, wide open. The one in Panama, I understand, doesn't even have glass in the windows, and little clouds come in and join the service for a while and float on off and do what clouds do subsequently. And that's the way the Baha'i cause is. So the study circles are for everybody. Now, how do people here in Reykjavik, or in Toronto, or in Frankfurt, or anywhere, how do they join all kinds of things. They want to learn Tai Chi. They want to learn macrame, maybe. They want to learn all kinds of things. There is no reason they should, and they certainly want to learn about themselves. They want to learn about what their reality is and how spiritual laws function in the personal life, because the faith is scientific in its method. These teachings are given to us to try so that we learn, because for us the faith is not blind belief. Faith is conscious knowledge. You try things. You don't give up the first disappointment. You try them, and you learn and you develop in capacities. Well, you know all this as well as I do. But non-Baha'is are not aware of this, and therefore we should be much more open. I'll tell you a story. The only reason you're willing to put up with this is because stories are always interesting, but it illustrates the point I'm making. When I was going to firesides, they were very successful firesides. At the Robarts' house, he became a hand of the cause eventually in Toronto. And here were all these Baha'i, most of them Baha'is, and the odd person would become a Baha'i. And I realized there was no way in the world I was going to join a religion. I simply didn't believe in a religion. I wasn't going to do that. And I felt deeply depressed because I liked these people's most interesting ideas. And what should I do? I was going to have to make a choice. And sure enough, one night I left the fireside. I can still remember I went to a little park between their house and my apartment. I sat down there, and I spent about half an hour going through the back and forth, the pros and the cons. I got up, and I started walking out of that park, having made up my mind to accept the fact that I was going to lose this wonderful relationship. There was no way I could pay the price, namely give up what I believe, my lack of belief, in order simply to continue this wonderful association that I had. I was walking out of the park, and all of a sudden an idea struck me. So if you're thinking of angels of light or anything, put that out of your mind, because it was very pedestrian. The idea suddenly came into my head. It was so obvious. This is the greatest thing you have ever encountered. There's nothing like this in the world. You don't know what God is. You don't know what a manifestation of God is. The only rational relationship you can have to this is to participate. This is as simple as that. I was far from thinking of things like serving. I was just going to participate. I went back and I told them. They were pleased, a little surprised, and I became a Baha'i. About 5 years later, shortly after that, I got married. My wife and I went pioneering. The guardian died. We'd pioneered to some small town in Ontario, St. Catharines, Ontario. And by this point, the American and Canadian plans were going into reverse instead of forward. And the hands were sending hands out to get us moving. And Mr. Robarts came to our part of the country, and he urged us to pray for the people in this goal area. Welland was the city we had, and so on. He said they're dying, spiritually dying. He said, here's what you should do. You should, every one of you in this room, you should pick somebody out in Welland, or if you don't know anybody in Welland, pick somebody in St. Catharines who you think has a possibility, and pray for them every single day for a month. At the end of the month, if they have not become a Baha'i, forget them. Pick somebody else out and do the same thing. And when you pray for them, pray with all your heart and then forget it that day. Don't badger yourself about it. Pray for them at night too. Forget it and go to sleep. He said, I remember once, some years ago, we hadn't had a declaration for some time in our fireside in Forest Hill in Toronto. And he said, and Audrey and I, his wife, decided that we picked one person. And when that person left, we sat down and we said the Tablet of Ahmed 9 times for Douglas Martin. And here we were all sitting listening like this, 20 or so of us listening. And I was listening with everybody else. It was about me. While I was sitting in the park talking myself out of it, they were praying me into it. And they won. There was no question as to which one had the power and the whole thing. Now, I suggest this to you because just to use the Ruhi method without doing this kind of thing, this kind of personal teaching, is not, that's the magic bullet approach. One has to do. The other thing you have to do, I think, is to continue public information activities. But those have to be consistent. People want to know. So advertise the things that people care about, not the things that you care about. What does the public care about? Advertise those things. And, I think a lot of people become Baha'is without knowing it. One day they're studying it the way it's they would study Tai Chi, and the next day they realize, like I did, well, this is I need to participate. I need to become part of this kind of thing. I think if we do this sort of thing in our personal teaching, in our public information, and so on, the day of mass campaigns out in the street and so on, that was in our adolescence. I don't say it wouldn't work in some countries, but we don't need it any longer. But if we think we cannot do things systematically, we are kidding ourselves. Just like people kid themselves about marriage. It's hard work. You work at it all the time systematically. You try everything. You make all the adjustments, and gradually the whole thing moves forward. That's what I believe very strongly. And I think that is going to work in Iceland like a house on fire. There is nothing to stop. People in this country are desperate. This is a country which has long ago given up God. Long ago. And people cannot live without God. It is abnormal to live without God. Now that's not the way popular opinion holds it. The popular opinion holds that it is normal to live without God. It is abnormal to believe in God or to get too carried away about it. But they've got it completely the other way around. The proof is, of course, they're failing and we're succeeding, if you wanted really to bring it right down to nuts and bolts. So I think that since we believe that people out there have souls, they have spiritual impulses, we have to do everything we possibly can to awaken them, not to enroll them in the faith, not to persuade them about the 12 principles or about the Bahá'í dispensation or about the covenant or the administrative order or some plan or any of these things, but to help them develop their own inner spiritual capacities to the point that at last they can see things the way we do. Now, that's what I honestly believe. I think that's the way that is working today all over the world. And believe me, it can work in Reykjavik just as easily as it can work in some little village off on the east coast of Iceland.
Thank you very much. And there are only 2 more. I'll give you both of them, even though they are quite different. I will give you both of those. And the first one builds on your. You talked about the Bahá'í involvement in the major conferences of the 90s, Rio, Beijing, Copenhagen, and we were all very much impressed with the role that the Bahá'í international community played in the Millennium Forum, and question related to if you had some comments on how you see the next steps and the future role of the Baha'i international community in these kind of international process of consensus building about the future of mankind at the intergovernmental level. And the other question is quite specific from a youth in the audience, and that relates to teaching Muslims and teaching Persian Muslims. And the question is, I have a Baha'i friend who likes to know about the Baha'i faith, and I've already given him Dawnbreakers and the book about Baha'u'llah's life, but he still wants more. And he wants more books, and he's very positive. Can I give him more information about the faith or not? And with that, these are the last questions.
Can I do it the other way around? Can I do the business of the Muslims, first of all? Muslims are people like everybody else. They have souls. They also have the benefit of the most recent of the great revelations before Baha'u'llah. So they are capable of responding to the cause. And they will certainly respond. Unfortunately, they are far, far, far more deeply prejudiced than all the other people of the world. It's just a fact. It's a historical circumstance. The clergy in the Islamic faith have been far more successful and far more ruthless, far more totally amoral than the leaders of any other community in the world in poisoning the minds of the Muslim population. But there's lots of evidence today that the Muslim world is waking up. There are liberal movements throughout the Muslim world. I know, for instance, the Friends in France held a big interfaith meeting, and they used the Senate chamber in the Palais de Luxembourg in Paris. Gorgeous venue, and they had a huge crowd, and they had big name speakers. I think they had an archbishop and the grand rabbi and people like upper level people. And they had the Mufti of Marseille, Mr. Ben Sheikh, his name is. Mr. Ben Sheikh comes from a very distinguished ecclesiastical family in Islam. His father is the rector of the Islamic Institute in Paris, if you've seen it, that gorgeous crystal building right on the Seine, one of the most beautiful modern buildings in Paris, the highest level in Islamic world in France, and one of the highest in the Western world period. So this is a man who's very distinguished. He came, he spoke about Islam. He said that there are liberal movements throughout Islam. The challenge, he said, to Islam is to try to bring Islam together with modernity. And this is a huge problem for the Muslim world generally. And so everybody was listening to this, including the Baha'is who were his hosts. They were all very interested in what he had to say. And then he said something that absolutely took their breath away. He said, all of us are trying to do this. He said, I'm involved myself. I have friends in the Sunni world and the Shia world. All of us trying to do it. And he said, lo and behold, while we are doing this, just à côté, just beside us here, are the Baha'is who are accomplishing it. And the Baha'is couldn't believe their ears. And he said the synthesis between the ideals of Islam and the ideals of modernity are manifest in the Baha'i community. And that was the conclusion of his talk. Now, he's not a Baha'i. He's not about to become a Baha'i. But it was his recognition of his freedom from the prejudices that you would think a man of that stature, particularly in the Muslim world. We have this marvelous shortwave radio program coming out of Washington now, Payamadust. I don't know how many of you know about it, but it's broadcasting. And they're getting tremendous response obviously from the Baha'is in Iran, but they're getting response from non-Baha'is who gather people in their homes to listen to it, because these Giti Ejtimai, who worked for the Voice of America, they have figured out a formula. And you know, in public information, formula is everything. If you figure out the right formula, because everybody's going blah, 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 blah. That's what advertising and public information is all about. It's just a cacophony of racket. And most people try and screen it out. But if you get the formula right, it just cuts through the whole thing like a knife through butter. And they have got the right formula. And it is arousing the most extraordinary responses from the Shia world. And of course we're sending them information, putting them in touch with Baha'is as well. Now the House of Justice has encouraged Persian Baha'is who understand the Muslim mentality to feel free to respond to questions, to share information and so on. But they have to understand when they do it that if the person decides to become a Baha'i, he is going to have to go through a far more rigorous process of examination by national and local assemblies than anybody who was just another Icelander. That's life. Because the danger to the Baha'i community in Persia is so serious, or Egypt, or Yemen, or Syria, or Jordan, or any place else, that we cannot play games with this. Nobody's going to be in any trouble in Canada if they become a Baha'i in Iceland, but maybe quite a different matter for someone who is a Muslim. So, yes, you can teach Muslims, and we have to anticipate that they will become Baha'is, but it is going to be a big struggle for them on the one hand, but on the other hand also, when they become Baha'is, they're going to become some of the best Baha'is. One of the most moving, one of the great bounties of being a member of the House of Justice is whenever some counselor arrives at the World Center, the House invites that person to come and meet with the House of Justice. And we spend an hour with that person because the House wants to understand first way, directly, what's going on in that part of the world, not just rely on reports. We had a Mr. Galadima, who is from West Africa. His countries are all Muslim: Senegal, Niger, Central African Republic, and so on, and French-speaking. Mr. Galadima came and sat with us, and he spoke only French, and only 3 of us spoke French. So we were having to translate. We had thinking questions we wanted to ask him, and somebody else would be saying, "Ask him so and so." So it was quite a lively session. And he made these he gave this extraordinary report, which we had heard about on paper, but he confirmed it, about the success of the Institute method in his part of Africa. And this person sitting next to me said, ask him why the people in his part of Africa have responded so enthusiastically and immediately, because they were moving right through the whole system. So I started to ask him in French, and as I was getting the words out of my mouth, I suddenly got embarrassed because I looked at his face, and you could see that he wondered why I was asking him this question. And I had to ask him because this person had urged me to do so. And when I finished asking him, there was a long, long pause, and he looked, and you could see he was trying to formulate an answer. And finally he just said, well, because the House of Justice asked us to. And you thought, this is a group of people who see things differently than those people who've been brought up in maybe a Christian or some Buddhist or Hindu or some other background. They are people who, if God wants them to do something, they do it. Of course, if they think God wants to go to them and blow up a supermarket, they'll do that too. But they were not interested in encouraging them to do that kind of thing. So, yes, there is no reason why we should not be teaching Muslims, as long as we bear in mind and don't hassle the national assemblies who take 6 months, 10 months with back and forth messages from the World Center to Iran, checking on all of the details. The other question had to do with...
The other question was on the Millennium.
Oh yes, the Millennium.
And sorry if I can, there's one question I left out that is related to that. And that's because the question on the Millennium Forum and the report of the Millennium Summit relates to the development of peace. And the question was if you could also comment on the relationship between the achievement of lesser peace by the year 2000 and the events of the world today.
Yes. Well, the Millennium Summit, as you know, the Baha'i representative, he was called the co-chair of the forum, the NGO. In fact, he was the chairman because there was no other chairman. He had, when he was elected or appointed by all of the other NGOs to be their representative, to be the chairman of the NGO forum, the Baha'is said, look, he's a man, why don't we also have a woman who's a co-chairman? So everybody said, okay, but the women's organizations could not agree who was going to be the woman who would be the co-chairman. So we ended up with only one chairman who was stuck with the name co-chairman. So Mr. Annan, Secretary General Kofi Annan, invited him personally. He didn't select somebody. He said, Mr. Adarom will represent all of the forum, all of the NGOs of the world. So he met there with the heads of state of the governments, and he presented the views of the forum. And that, to us, was wonderful confirmation of things we had anticipated. But it was simply a signal of the confidence and the trust that our non-Baha'i friends place in us. And that's what I was talking about earlier on. This is going to go on and on because the things that we are doing are becoming more and more and more important. The things that we were doing, and we've been doing for 50 years, did not seem very important 50 years ago. But with every year that's passed, the things we've been doing about the education of girls, about all of the other things that you know we're involved in, have become steadily the most important issues in the world, and we are making a success of it. And when I think of this, it reminds me, because I'm a historian and my whole brain is wired to history. I can't think in anything but historical terms. And I always think of the experience of Europe in the Dark Ages. The Roman Catholic Church, well, let's step back. The Roman Empire did not collapse one day, Thursday, April the 4th, and that was the end of the Roman Empire. It took 300 years for the Roman Empire gradually to disintegrate. How did that happen? People stopped collecting taxes. They stopped repairing roads. They stopped having schools. They stopped having courts. They stopped having any way for people to travel safely any place in the empire and so on. And gradually it simply ran down, and thugs, who later called themselves barons, put stockades around their stone houses, and everybody came and became serfs of those thugs who were the leaders of the feudal class that emerged in Europe. Well, you know, this was history of Europe. Now, while this was happening, one organization, one institution began to do something unique. That was the Catholic Church. What the Catholic Church began to do all over Europe was, and this is something every woman in the room will understand probably better than any man, what the Catholic Church began to do was the housekeeping of Europe. It began to do all the things that were undramatic, unglamorous, unheroic. They began holding schools, they began having little courts, they began taking care of women, they set up hostels, they did all of these things. And as they did it, their authority, their moral authority, steadily grew more and more and more. Europe fell into the church's lap like ripe fruit off a tree. Ultimately, with all the wars that were going on, that's what ultimately happened, because the housekeeping was all ultimately that really mattered to the people of Europe. That, I honestly believe, is what lies ahead of the Baha'i world. I think we will be increasingly seen as the people who are honest, who are trustworthy, who are doing or helping other people, because it's not only ourselves, to do the housekeeping. And these summits that have been taking place are the steps, or signposts, or mileposts, whatever you want to call them, along the way. How long will it take? One of us, all of us, we have no idea at all. We know that the lesser peace has begun. We know that we could have had the most great peace, but the rulers of the world rejected it. One thing I do want to say is that we at last understand something that we never understood when I was a new Baha'i. The Guardian had said, Abdu'l-Baha had said that in response to some question, he was asked about the 1335th day of Daniel. And he said, that will be 1335 years from whatever the date was, because figures are not my strong point. And they figured this out to the period between 1957 and 1963, depending on how you calculated it. But there's no doubt it was in this period, 57 to 63. And he said, in that day universal peace will be firmly established. It will be most glorious. Well, 57 came, 63 came. The world's idea of what universal peace was certainly was not established. The Soviet Union was still flourishing. Now we look back on it and we see what happened. We see that at those years, a cross-section of the human race actually managed to do something that had never been done in history. It created a central institution to which a cross-section of the whole of humankind gave its allegiance. And that community is growing, the authority of the institution is growing, and you see now what Abdu'l-Baha meant by the foundation of universal peace. Universal peace, the most great peace, will only come when the authority of the covenant and the administrative order is understood by everyone. But the foundation has been laid, and the foundation cannot be changed. It's like when conception takes place in a woman's womb. She has a baby. She doesn't have a bunny rabbit or a tadpole or something else, no matter what it might look like if it was under a microscope. The essential organic distinction has already occurred. It's only a matter of that system growing and developing and revealing its capacities. That's what I think the lesser peace really involves. I think the lesser peace has been going on for decades. And I think if you look at the writings of the Guardian, he seems to trace it back to Woodrow, of all people, to Woodrow Wilson and the idea of world government, the incredible idea of the League of Nations. So the lesser peace is a process. But clearly, with the end of this century, the path